What was the base? What was the basis for this? Well, um, folks may be aware that recently the Supreme Court issued an order which outlawed affirmative action in college admissions. The Trump administration and the Education Department has taken the view, and they've interpreted that ruling very broadly to say anything that promotes diversity in any institution that receives federal funding, even if it doesn't relate to college admissions, is also illegal. And so that seems to be the basis for them taking this position that anything connected to DEI will either stop or that institution will risk losing its federal funding. Another big thing that happened, I mentioned earlier the gutting of the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. That has happened. They've laid off, the Secretary of Education has laid off half of that staff. And it's at a critical moment that this has happened. There are over 20,000 ongoing investigations of civil rights violations. And when we're talking about civil rights in the context of education, we're talking about claims of racial discrimination, disability discrimination, sexual harassment. It could be national origin discrimination, all sorts of discrimination where children or students are being treated differently because of some protected characteristic. That is what the Office of Civil Rights does. They investigate those cases, they try to resolve them with schools, and if they can't be resolved, either the department or the Department of Justice will commence a litigation to solve those issues. In related to DEI, the department is also actually frozen funds. So there were millions of dollars that the Department of Education had committed to various states, state school districts, for example, related to recruiting and retaining teachers, teacher training programs. Those funds have been frozen. And the Supreme Court recently upheld the Trump's ability to do that, right? They said to the administration, you can do that. That's critical. So we are now in this moment, prior to Trump being elected, we were experiencing teacher shortages. And so now this money, which was earmarked for the purpose of training teachers and importantly, getting them to teach in schools that have the highest need, schools in cities, in the inner cities, rural schools, schools with a large proportion of low-income students, that money's being frozen. So what will that do to the pipeline of teachers who would have gone and received that training and then taught in those schools? So those are some of I guess, the four of the big things that I noticed.
Yeah. I'm hearing, we're having major cuts to staffing, especially in the Civil Rights Office. We have threats or funding that's been frozen. And we have this attack on DEI. And when I think about special education, when I take the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, they feel very similar because our goal in special education is to include students and to make sure education is equitable because we know there's a diversity of people with various needs and abilities. And so how do these issues that you brought up specifically relate to families with disabilities? How does the gutting of Civil Rights Office, how does attacks on DEI, how do these funding cuts, you already spoke a bit about, it makes it even harder to recruit more staff and we're understaffed now. So what are some of the ways that you see this affecting families raising children with disabilities?
Well, you correctly point out some of the, I don't know if you call them ironies or just there are conflicts in what the administration and the Department of Education is doing. So on the one hand, Trump has expressly said that funding that was targeted or committed to provide services and programming, guidance for children with disabilities and learning differences, that it won't be touched, right? On the one hand. And then on the other hand, because Trump doesn't want to promote DEI, they decide to freeze teacher training programs. Well, I view those two things as competing. It's contradictory, right? For instance, in the District of Columbia, we have a shortage of psychologists. We have a shortage of speech and language pathologists. There are some schools in the District of Columbia that have had no speech and language pathologists for this whole school year. So that's a workforce development issue. One of the functions of the Department of Education, in fact, there's an office called the Office of Special Education Programs, is to work with school districts on issues like workforce development. But if you cut the funding for teacher training, I think that's going to affect your ability, for instance, to get people like speech pathologists in the schools or special education teachers. So you can't say that you support children with disabilities and learning differences on the one hand, and then because of DEI, say that you're going to cut funding. It's going to directly, I think there's a huge risk that that's going to affect kids with disabilities and with learning differences. We need special education teachers. We need speech and language pathologists. We need psychologists, and we need more of them. So that's a concern. The other concern, when you cut the Office of Civil Rights, you lay off half of or more of its workers. They're already burdened. I read somewhere that each person in the Office of Civil Rights that was involved in investigating claims had 50 cases. So now you've cut half of that group in half. You've cut that group in half. Advocates and even former attorneys or attorneys who are working in that group have said you've made it practically impossible to investigate those cases, right? So these are attorneys who receive complaints, they read the complaints, they actually have, at times, have to go out into the field. They have to go to a school and maybe inspect the premises to see if it's accessible to a child with a wheelchair, right? How can you do that? In addition, there were 12 regional offices responsible, 12 regional offices throughout the country where attorneys and investigators actually were located and where they did their jobs of investigating these claims. 7 out of the 12 offices, and these 7 regional offices, they were in major cities like San Francisco and Chicago. They've been closed, right? So you've closed half the offices. Lawsuits have been filed by nonprofit legal organizations saying that even though Trump hasn't officially closed the Department of Education, they've effectively gutted its ability to do its essential function. And one of those is to enforce civil rights laws. So those are the two big things. You worry that cuts to funding will affect teacher pipelines and teacher employment. You need teachers for kids that have learning differences. And then civil rights enforcement. It's a fact that children with disabilities and learning differences are more likely to be discriminated against, to be harassed and abused in school. And now you've just gutted the office responsible for enforcing those civil rights laws. It's a problem.
I know one thing that's been said in defense of these changes is that it doesn't get rid of the central law that protects children, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is that even without the Department of Education, that law is still in place. So families still have those protections. How do you interpret that?
Well, I mean, I go back to the point that I just made, which is, yes, the law remains on the books, but if you're not enforcing the law, or if the department doesn't have the resources to enforce the law, then what's the point? So we have civil rights civil rights laws in the books that prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability. You've cut half the staff. Many of those cases will not be investigated, or if they're investigated, it's going to take much longer, right? Then what's the point? You've got a law, but it's not being implemented, right?
So for the complaints families would have, the Civil Rights Office was one of the best destinations to go. Here's an issue. They're going to investigate. They're going to take care of this, not only for my child, but really for all the children in the district or the state, where the complaints are filed. Without this backstop, it seems to me that if we don't have a federal agency enforcing this, what do families do to guarantee these rights stay in place? Is it the state level? Is it with the courts? Where do we go as parents to make sure that our children's rights are being fulfilled and that the law is being implemented?
I don't think that we know the answer to that. You touched on a couple of potential answers, but they may not be the best choices, the best or the most economical answers. So you mentioned go to court. Of course, you can. The benefit of having the Office of Civil Rights fully staffed is that when you file your complaint, the Office of Civil Rights is going to do the investigation for you. They're going to be your attorney, really. They're investigating the issue, and they're doing all the work that an attorney would do if you hired the attorney. They're investigating it. If they find that there has been non-compliance with civil rights laws, they will negotiate with the schools to try to resolve the matter. There's a whole mediation program that's set up if the parent and the school district want to try to work it out. But if all of that's effectively not available, right? And it's, by the way, it's free. You file your complaint, you don't have to pay any money. So if that's not available, you could go to court, but then you have to pay an attorney, right? That's the prospect. So you're not prohibited from going to court, but going to court it requires a financial commitment, right? One of the laws that protects children with disabilities is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. When you think about discrimination, the essential damage that occurs to the person that's discriminated against, it's an emotional damage. It's a loss of dignity, right? And so here we are again. Elections have consequences. The Supreme Court recently ruled that in Section 504 cases, no emotional damages are available. So if you come to an attorney like me and your kid has been discriminated against, Section 504 to me is not a law that I want to pursue because you might win, but you don't get any damages. So what's the point? Maybe your state has a civil rights law. You have your own state civil rights law that protects children with disabilities. It might make sense to to hire an attorney and sue under state civil rights law. That might be an option. Also, state education agencies all have a process by which parents can file a state complaint. Now, the question is whether those state education agencies would take up complaints of disability discrimination. Often they take up complaints where a child is not receiving the services or instruction that he's required to receive under his IEP, but I have yet to see state agencies investigate discrimination matters as they pertain to children that have learning differences. So it remains to be seen what options are practical for parents, what options are economically feasible for parents. That those things actually matter.
Yeah. When we were getting started, you and I were just chatting before the webinar began, and you had mentioned you can't put your child's education on autopilot. And, for a lot of families, there's not going to be a complaint. And for many families, there's not an awareness that there is a problem. And, for those who do escalate, we had the option of Department of Education. We have the option of courts, which is expensive and time consuming and has all those problems. You can go to states. More than half the states, I believe, do not fully comply with IDEA right now, according to a report that came out last year. So states are not necessarily reliable. It seems like not putting your education on autopilot really starts with how you engage with the school. And so I'm curious about what might be different now in today's policy environment versus what it would have been a year ago. And what does that mean not to be on autopilot? What should a parent be thinking about regularly so that these issues don't evolve into something that requires a great deal of conflict or money, and other issues?
Yeah, I think you can't be on autopilot is the theme that I would roll with. And what I mean by that is, and you said that you felt states often aren't in compliance with IDEA, and so you can't rely on them to comply. And since there's going to be, there's a threat of less enforcement at the federal level, then what would you expect states to do? All of a sudden, are they going to come into the breach and save the day? Well, based on past performance, I would not expect that. So as I'm also a parent, um, and it's my view that no matter where your child goes to school, if you've got a child that has learning differences, or if you don't have a child, if your child does not have learning differences, you can't just trust the school. You have to be involved now more than ever. So, what can parents do? Let's say that your child is starting school, your child is a young age. You have to pay attention to how your child is doing in school. You have to talk to your child's teachers. You have to pay attention to what your teachers say. You have to pay attention to their observations of your child. You have to pay attention to what your child is doing and showing you at home about his academic performance, his reading, his speech, his listening to following directions. So if you see a problem, if you're not sure about something, you've got to speak up and say something about it. And you should do that in writing, if possible. You should do it in writing. So if you notice that your child repeatedly, as a young person, young child, can't or does not follow directions, there could be a speech or a processing issue. And you should raise this with your child's school, right? If you notice that you're getting lots of calls, repeated calls weekly or daily or multiple calls a day about your child's behavior, that is usually a sign that your child is struggling academically in school. You should pay attention to that and don't just accept it as a discipline issue. It's usually a symptom of something else going on. To the extent your children already have IEPs, you've got to pay attention to what your teachers are saying, what teachers are saying about your child's progress, right? And pay attention to discrepancies. If your child is getting passing grades in the classes that he or she is taking, but when the school gives its 3 times a year academic assessments, your child is performing below grade level on the 3 times a year reading assessment that's given. That's a discrepancy. Getting an A in reading, but on the standardized test that's given 3 times a day to assess your child, 3 times a year to assess your child's reading, and they're reading below grade level, that's a problem. You should raise that with the school. Um, Also, communication with the school is important, right? When you're dealing with matters concerning your children, it's an emotional thing because it's your child. You want your child to perform well and to get a good education. It's important to put things in writing to school officials, your child's teacher, your child's service provider, your child's principal, to ensure that there is a record of you showing that you're concerned, that you're involved, and that you're asking questions so that you and the school can try to find solutions to whatever the problem may be.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like advocacy, meaning speaking up for your child, keeping documentation, being able to show receipts, when you need to, um, is not changing necessarily now, but it's more important now.
I think so. I think so. And I think you, and it really does start at home. You have to, you must pay attention to what's going on. In this busy world that we live in with work and other responsibilities, we're going to have to pay attention to our children. We're going to have to ask questions of our children. If your child receives speech and language therapy weekly, you should know who the speech therapist is, and you should be able to say to your child, did you see Mr. So and so for speech this week?
Mhm.
And do that on a weekly basis, because if your IEP says your child's supposed to receive 30 minutes of speech twice a week and that's not happening, you can't let that continue because the problem gets worse over time. You have
Yeah.
to check in with your child.
Yeah. It's interesting that with all these big changes, what it comes down to is fundamentals of raising a child, particularly one with a disability, where the world is not necessarily set up for their success. And our role as parents is really to go through and be like, you know, where do things need to be changed so that my child has a fair shot at the education they deserve? Um, to wrap up, I know for a lot of families right now, there's a lot of feeling of overwhelmed, of powerlessness. Um, what do you think could give them hope or a sense of agency, particularly, in this policy climate where we can't predict what's going to happen in, a few months, in a year? What would you say to folks?
I would say a couple of things. First of all, I think it's natural for folks in an environment such as this one, which feels chaotic, to not participate in the chaos by, for instance, looking at the news or reading the newspapers. I understand that. I can't watch CNN or any of the networks on a daily basis. I think it's important to curate your news. So if you're interested in education issues, then you know what? Subscribe to an education newsletter that focuses on kids with learning differences and read that, right? Um, you cannot stick your head in the sand. You've got to pay attention. Doesn't mean that you have to consume everything in the news, but curate your news, and you've got to pay attention. Number two, you must understand that there are people that are fighting. So in each of the issues that we discussed, for instance, the gutting of the Office of Civil Rights, there are law firms and nonprofit legal organizations and even like teachers unions who are filing lawsuits in federal court to challenge the Trump administration on some of the things that it's doing at the federal level. So there is a court challenge on the gutting of OCR. There's a court challenge on the issue of the Trump administration threatening to withhold funds to schools that implement so-called DEI. There are people who are in groups who are challenging, and they are having some success in those challenges. So there's hope there. And then the rest of it, again, I think in part falls on you as the individual, right? Um, I think one way to sort of deal with the stress of this chaos is to actually do something, right? Talk to your child, keep records, talk to your teachers, your child's teachers. Action, I think, helps relieve some of the stress and helps to clear some of the chaos because you're actually doing something about the problem.
Yeah, I like that. Action. Yeah, my dad used to say, do what makes you anxious first. Whatever your priority list was, whatever the scariest thing is, just do that first.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
All right. In the last couple of minutes, we had a couple of questions that I just wanted to read. One says, based on Trump's new executive order allowing teachers to physically discipline students, how will this affect special education and kids with learning differences?
Well, we have to remember that that none of Trump's executive orders are necessarily legal, right? So let me say that again. Just because Trump signs an executive order, that executive order cannot conflict with or somehow erase applicable federal law. So with respect to that issue, I think you have to look at it from a case by case basis, right? So there are state laws and some states allow corporal punishment, right? There are others that prohibit it. For instance, the District of Columbia, it's prohibited. Um, Physically punishing students, I think could adversely affect children with disabilities because generally, children with disabilities and learning difference are more likely to be subject to harassment and abuse. So if the school is using corporal punishment to discipline kids with disabilities, it's more than likely going to be something that I think attorneys could look at and say would be a potential subject of litigation based on discrimination under Section 504 or Title II of ADA.
Mhm.
So again, you have to pay attention. Um, just because Trump says it doesn't necessarily mean it's right or that it's consistent with law. Um, and you have to talk to your children. You have to talk to your children. And if something doesn't feel right, then you got to make sure and advocate for your child, number one. And if you're not able to do so, be willing to contact an advocate to represent you and your child in school.
Right. Thanks, Nigel. We have one other question that's a little bit long. Clark, we'll email you to follow up on this just for time's sake,
Mhm.
but I appreciate the question. Uh, right now, I want to say thank you to you, Nigel, for joining us, and to all the people who've signed on to the webinar. It's really I don't want to say an exciting time, but it's an emotionally intense time for a lot of people. And 30 minutes is not going to be enough of a conversation, but I'm hoping that this was informative, that gave you a chance to see what actions you can take, how you can be turning off autopilot and not be in a self-driving car, and taking the wheel, just to stretch the metaphor a little bit further. So thank you all for joining.